Good morning, Benya.
Good morning, Heather.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Good spring
No.
day.
So for those of you watching, listening, my name is Heather Malenshek. I am the Chief Marketing Officer of Land O'Lakes, and I have the absolute pleasure of talking to Benya Kraus today. So Benya, do you want to introduce yourself for folks?
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. I am Benya Kraus. I am calling from Waseca, Minnesota. This is the background of our downtown, and I am one of the co-founders of Lead for America, and now the executive director of Lead for Minnesota. Our mission is to support young people in returning and reinvesting in their hometowns.
Fantastic. So I couldn't be more honored to be talking with you and being involved in the Share the Mic initiative, because the messages you have are really important and inspiring for others to hear. But Benya, before we get started, I just wanted to open up by expressing my own, very sincere concerns and shock about the tragedies that occurred last week in Georgia. And I think, the events that we're hearing in the news in relation to Asian Americans. So I know the events have hit you hard, and I just wanted to open up by giving you a chance to maybe address them if you'd like to.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it has been a very heartbreaking week in particular, but this whole past year, I think as we've seen national rhetoric of increasing around Asian Americans in the context of COVID being associated more as a virus and a disease as opposed to like us as full humans. There's a component that, this whole past year, it's the uptick in Asian American violence is not something that is new in the context of our history of thinking of waves of anti-Asian violence. But I think it's definitely notable that this past year, there's been a deep sense and real feeling of fear and insecurity within our community. And yeah, I think this past week has been heartbreaking to see just, the atrocity of this. I wrote a piece in the Minnesota Women's Press that were kind of some reflections as I think this makes a lot of us Asian American young women speak with our moms and our community too, as we process this feeling of fear, right? And sadness in it. And so it's also been heartbreaking to have those continued conversations. And, I know my mom has been telling me to checking in on whether I'm locking my door. And my mom also has worked in throughout her life in massage therapy. And she does it because she's a healer. And to think, that the situation could have been, her behind that bullet is definitely a scary one to be holding. But so, I'm in the sense I'm glad that we are having conversations around this. And I hope also that the heartbreak is something like this universal heartbreak that whether you're Asian American or not, that we can all feel that there's this opportunity to have very serious conversations. And as I wanted to share in my Minnesota Women's Press article too, that this is also a time for us to think about how can we deepen our friendships and our curiosity for one another, not just in crisis time, but like take inventory of the relationships that we have. Are we taking time to know the fullness of the humans around us? And I think seeing the humanity in each other helps us see people as not as like a virus or an other. Yeah. But
yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think I think you've hit on so many things that really are part of your story. And I think part of the message that I think is super important for us to get out there. And, we had a chance to spend a little bit of time together last week, which was awesome. And I can't believe how many parallels we have in our lives. We talked a little bit about, our connection, I would say connection to Thailand. I was in Thailand for a little while in my career, but it's one of my favorite countries in the world. And I know part of your background, the fact that we both have a grandpa that was called Jim, which was incredible. And I think, if I go back to that word that you talked about with curiosity, and I think that's something that sort of, it's been a sort of a foundational thing for me in my life. And so from my very early days with my grandpa Jim, who was, in the war, serving in the desert, living in different sort of cultures, to the stamp collection, which is our other parallel, that he gave me, where I would look at stamp collections from all these different countries and try and figure out, like, what would it be like to experience that culture and be brought up in that way. And I'm from a very small village in Scotland too. So I think I would love to just talk a little bit about, your background, help people understand where you're coming from and why this is, why this conversation is important to you. So Benya, let others hear a little bit about your amazing story.
Yeah, well, I love our Grandpa Jim and stamp collection similarity. I come from, I say, a mix of Waseeka, Minnesota, and Bangkok, Thailand. So with my grandpa Sutin, my mom's dad, he grew up also in agriculture. He was the dean of an agricultural school in northern Thailand. They grew up close to and shepherding a mango farm. So that was across the country in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and then, or not across the country, across the world, sorry. And then, on the other side of the hemisphere was my grandpa Jim. And my dad grew up as one of 9 on our family farm that is now in its 6th generation of farm stewardship. So I think in both of my families and my roots have also been rooted in their land as well. And I was born in Thailand, but I spent every summer and winter growing up in Waseeka. And for those who don't know, Waseeka is a rural community of about 10,000 people in southern Minnesota. And I loved this place and had a lot of nostalgia for it. But when I was growing up, I didn't see it as the forefront of where, change and excitement was happening. And I think also the idea of roots didn't feel super significant to me, in large part because, I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me in my community. But the idea or the concept of roots, I think, really sunk into me. I went to school out in Boston, and I studied international relations, and I was on this track of thinking that I was going to move every 2 to 3 years to a different place. And that's what I was attached to, until one summer I came back to Waseeka due to a family situation. And I was reintroduced both to this community in a new light. There was like these buds of entrepreneurship taking place all around us. There were new immigrants coming and making this place home too. And also I got a chance to learn more about my uncles and hear, we'd get on the 4-wheeler and they'd tell me stories of our land and have me think about, all that my grandpa Jim did to steward this land in a way that was responsible to the past generations and also had the sense of accountability to the next generations. And I think all these stories just kind of sunk more deeply into me, of like everything and all of who I am can be traced back to the people who gave so much to this place and made it even possible for me to be alive. So maybe this is more than you needed to hear, but I think that background, or that thinking of roots, the thinking of, the stamp collection comes in, and that my mail lady knew I was collecting stamps every summer when I was here in Waseeka. We just wait at the mailbox for her. And when I came back that summer, it had been several years since I had seen her, but she had kept all the stamps that she couldn't deliver in the mail, because she, I guess, like knew that one day I'd be back. And I think it's just those moments of, it's like inexplicable, like kindness of like people who care for you that have no really reason to, that I think was humbling when I thought about what do I want to do with my life, and knowing that my life only exists because of these places and these people made me want to do something that was tying my life purpose into like serving like the next generation of these places. So that's a little bit about me and the concept of roots that have felt really important.
No. Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as I think about my upbringing, I know we talked about this a little bit last week, this tiny village in Scotland that I'm part of, which actually has some businesses that most people will be aware of around the world, like Macallan whiskey is born there, and Walker's shortbread, which is another one of my favorite foods. But I think for me, when I go home, and I've been living in the US now for about 30 years, but home here is still in Scotland. And one of the most amazing things, and you talk about that sort of sense of kindness and love and feeling fully accepted. I'll go home and people could care less about what my title is or where I've been or what I've been doing. I'm still, the little girl that used to go to the bar with my dad when I was a kid. And it's just that sense of I think comfort and safety almost that I get when I come home that is a very big part of who I am, and they're a very big part of my upbringing and making me who I am today. So it's very I really relate to what you're talking about with the idea of your roots. I think and I think honoring those in what you're doing today. So talk to us a little bit about what's keeping you busy right now, Benya, and your message that you're out there. I mean, it's just really interesting. When we talked last week we talked a lot about being the only in various situations, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of things that are keeping me busy, one of our core programs of the organization I lead is this 2-year paid fellowship that brings young people back to their hometowns or home regions, or sometimes more broadly home state, to tackle what we say are their community's magic wand challenges, right? And so in that process, I get to work with young people across our country who are coming back to places where they might have been one of the few minorities in the community. And I think oftentimes, if you don't, as much as I talk about roots, right, there can be conditions upon who can have roots to place. And knowing that, even my own story and connection to Waseeka is a little different, because I wasn't born and raised there. And so I didn't feel like I had like this maybe responsibility or acceptance, like just intrinsically there, right? But it was through relationships that roots were able to be sown, right? And so now when I think of for a lot of our rural communities, the biggest demographic shift is and also what is necessary for our places to thrive is how we welcome new people and new immigrants. And so I think, it asks and is this opportunity for somebody who has 6th generation of roots to the land to meet and become friends and be curious of and with people who have maybe 6 days or 6 months of roots to this place, but knowing that that we share this place together. So how can we also share our lives together? So I guess, when I think about the work that we do, we have some fellows that are returning back because they have had a reason or have had experiences where they were loved, but I think also sometimes may have had an experience that maybe they didn't feel wholly seen or loved, but know that there is a purpose perhaps to having gone through that, where they can take that experience and bring it back to a place that they know they love, but expand that idea of roots to people who are the next generation of people who look like them, right? And I think there's also some cases where, when we think about it broadly of home state, we have had some examples of fellows who grew up in the Twin Cities, but are moving up to the Iron Range because their particular skill can be a valuable purpose to that grand challenge that community is solving. And so now we have this idea of, 2 different places, but where purpose can converge with one another. And so I think also that's such a big part of every community's development, but I focus a lot on rural and tribal places, and I think we see in that there can be love is your purpose to return, or your vocation and gifts can be your purpose to return. But in either case, how do we get people to be committed to these places is also how do we love those people and give them something and a reason to also love those places too. And for me, racial equity, social equity is wrapped up in there. We cannot think about roots and expanding our roots and expanding how we love one another if we don't also think about racial equity as a cornerstone to how we love each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting for me because I think about we talk a lot about stereotypes. This is one of the reasons why I get so excited about your generation, because there are a lot of, the media talks about your generation as being, entitled and tech absorbed and disconnected and all of these things. And it's like, the reality is, I look at your generation and think, my God, like, what could we have done if we were that way? I think you're some of the most altruistic, selfless people in the world. And I particularly love what you're doing because of the rural component and tribal community component to this. But I think just in general, just thinking this way about how you make a better world, I don't think was on the minds of Gen X and others when we were going through our careers. So, I applaud what you're doing, and I'm so excited to be able to, as I said, get this message out and have people engaged too. So just that concept of the only, I think I find it quite fascinating, and I'm wondering, how does that affect you? How does that show up in your sort of professional life and maybe in your leadership style? How do you approach life as being perhaps one of, in the situation where you are the only?
Yeah, I think it has been, it has pushed and helped me, and like been a huge part of my growth to know that that I can relate to and like understand very much, like going into a room and feeling, whether it's like a meeting that, I'm presenting at, and I can very almost immediately know that I might be the only one who looks like me or has some of the identities that I do. And that there's been enough experiences where I've had to maybe like train up myself to like say things a certain, like, I don't want to say things a certain, but know that maybe there's something I have to prove when I first get there, of that I have to prove that I'm articulate and smart and deserve to be there in perhaps ways that if you are entering a room where your identity is maybe more familiar,
Right.
where that's not like the first like baggage or thing that you need to prove, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess like I talk about the growth or like opportunity. It is, I don't want to say that that's like okay, right? As in like, I wish we had a world in which anyone could step in and that automatically the fullness of what they can offer and the fullness of their humanity is seen right away. But I think there's a piece of like knowing that like that has not always been my case, kind of calls me into then when I meet with like anyone, whether they are, another woman of color or an older white man, of if I am asking and like want so much to be seen in my full humanity, it also like calls me into also wanting to see that for others too, regardless of what identity you hold. And I think what is challenging is that like when you go through so many life experiences where you see yourself as being like othered always, that it's hard to sometimes not have your guard up. And so I really appreciate when I can be seen first in my full humanity and then like taken seriously in that. And so how can I also try to do that for like anyone else that I am with, right? And so yeah, I think it's the, when you are the only, there's maybe some extra like work in the, like at the start to feel like, yeah, I deserve to be here. It's, I think part of the work is, what I try to do is if I can treat every person as humanly as possible, my hope is that through those human relationships, it leads to a transformation in which we grow accustomed to doing that for every person, regardless of their age, their gender, their skin color, that we are practicing kind of like flexing our human muscles of how we do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point. It's just really, as you said, really understanding from both perspectives. And that's about having that level of curiosity and understanding. And I think that's super important. So we talk about rural communities, and obviously, for Land O'Lakes, that's very much at the heart of what we do, and obviously what you're engaged with too, Benya. And think about my career, and I feel like another parallel I would say I've drawn is that I've spent a lot of my time kind of busting through stereotypes. I would say from the time I was like, I used to get asked things when I would travel about Scotland, and people would say, "Do you have electricity?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, we have electricity in Scotland." But even the brands I've worked on, I think about, I work for Harley Davidson, and I used to talk to people about, motorcyclists are some of the most philanthropic people and the nicest people you'll ever meet, not necessarily how people sometimes view them. And I think about rural communities, right? And I see this a lot of stereotyping that happens around rural communities and what it isn't, instead of maybe what it is. And I think I'm interested to hear from you. How do we shift some of the conversation from the stereotypes that we have within rural communities and get it to, because the other piece of this, I think, is the impact of the pandemic, because I'm hopeful that some of the changes that we've seen happen throughout the pandemic are going to be enduring and actually going to last. So, people maybe moving out of cities because they're not constrained and tethered to a city anymore. And in some ways, rural communities and rural living might become, aspirational in many cases. So how do you think about how we stop that conversation or change that conversation, Benya?
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of it is how do we build relationship, and it sounds like something so simple, but I mean, Heather, even when we have spoken together of the similarities that we find, right, that, how is it that Ireland and Thailand can have so much commonality with one another, and to be able to definitely honor their distinction and their difference, but then know that there are some universal experiences of like our feeling from like our neighbors, or like the fact that across the world from each other, that stamps could have brought us such a sense of curiosity for the world, right? So I think, we, from both an urban and rural standpoint, there are stereotypes that we have of each other because we've allowed media headlines to tell us what type of relationship we can expect from one another. And I think that is just not accurate to actually like how humans work actually and so, I think there is work that in rural communities we need to do of telling our stories better, of being able to, lift up the dynamism of like entrepreneurship that is taking place, be able to, speak to, yes, some real challenges, but also what are the real change makers that are tackling them head on every day, just like how there are also real challenges in urban areas. And there are people at the front lines of tackling those things too, especially when we think too about racial equity. I also don't appreciate the narrative that racial equity work is only happening in urban places, because it's also happening in rural communities too. And there are people advocating to tackle stereotypes that we have, not just geographically, but like of one another, that I think both in urban and rural places that we are collectively dealing with here. And I think to erase that stuff is not happening, or not to tell those stories, then makes it come across that, that value of like loving your neighbor regardless of who they are, and like loving them as human isn't happening in rural communities, which just is not true. So I think it's a storytelling piece. And I think the more opportunities where we can learn about our interconnections is what's going to like accelerate this change in narrative. And thirdly, when it's tough in a COVID land, but I think there is so much to say about actually going and like visiting one another. And I, the just like the power of invitation, I think you need curiosity to like extend the invitation to another human to visit you, but also to like do the work of visiting and coming to their places and our places too. So I think it's just this that's what I'd hope to see be the fuel of the change in narrative.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that we can be a part of some of that storytelling too, because I think that's really important. Are you? I want to probably sort of wrap with a couple of things, but what do people really need to know about the work that you're doing, and how can people get involved and engaged, Benya?
Yeah. Well, so if there are young leaders watching this right now that are thinking about places that they've called home, and are thinking of ways that I can serve and take the gifts that perhaps I've also been able to receive elsewhere, but now thinking of maybe this is the time where those gifts can be used in a way that is in service to the people and places that have served me, right? If you're thinking that right now, our application for fellowships are live, and you can go to our website. It's www.lead4america.org. So that's nationally. Here in Minnesota, it's lead4minnesota.org, and you'll see some opportunities to apply and what communities are participating, or if you want to chart your way back to your hometown too. And so I'll share that as number one. If you are a community that is realizing that for us to thrive as a rural place, we need to make sure the next generation is engaged and involved, that we need to make sure that anyone can make this place home. We'd love to work with you and work together about how we might do that. So visit our website as well, and happy to get involved in that way.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on one last thing from the writing that you did around this. I know we're going to post that link to your essay as well, Benya. There was one comment you made in there which I thought was really linked to the work you're doing, and I thought was really interesting. Is sort of almost ask not what some place can do for you, but what you can do for them. And I think, what can you bring to a rural community to help support racial and social equity and by vibrancy and vitality within that rural community. So I think that's a wonderful message and a wonderful sentiment to give. And again, it's one of the reasons why I get so excited about your generation and the work that you're doing, particularly Benya. And I'm thrilled and honored to be part of being able to get that message out. And I hope that we stay connected. Because I can't, as you said, to your point, like I can't believe how many parallels we have in life, and I'm really inspired by what you're doing. So thank you so much. It's been a joy getting to know you, and let's continue so.
Ditto here. Thanks so much for having me and sharing your story with me too. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thanks, Benya.